Good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC Gurukul live lecture series. And as you know, we have been covering world literature at the level of languages and countries as well as cultures. And we have covered most of the countries, barring the European continent. Today is the last lecture of the present area that we have been covering, and that is Japanese literature. And for this we have the expert Dr. Payal Nagpal, who teaches English literature in Janaki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University, in the Department of English. And she has done special work on literary theory, feminism, world drama, and drama in India. And she is a known person in terms of publication. She has published articles, she has published books. They have been published here as well as abroad. And Dr. Payal Nagpal would be today speaking on modern Japanese poetry. And viewers, before we request Dr. Payal Nagpal to speak, let me tell you that towards the end of the lecture, in the last 20 minutes, that is, starting from 10:40, we would be taking questions, and we would like you to also respond to certain things that might have been said during the lecture. You can raise questions, you can make your observations, you can differ with us, you can offer an alternative point, whatever you wish is there to be done in these 20 minutes that start from 10:40 and go up to 11. And the toll-free number for calling us up at 10:40 is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, the toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. Now I request Dr. Payal Nagpal to welcome Dr. Payal Nagpal, and since you have to give share points and your understanding on modern Japanese poetry, so maybe you can start with a statement and then we can chat about it. So you can do that.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Today's lecture is on modern Japanese poetry, and it's important to first understand this element of modernity and the way it emerges in Japan. And for this we need to just look a little bit at the historical context of what happens at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century in Japan, for us to really speaking understand the need for a kind of modern idiom in the context of Japanese poetry. So if we look at it, for a long while, Japan was under what was called the Tokugawa shogunate. So they were under the Tokugawa shogunate, and this finally collapsed in around 1868. And this was followed by the formation of a new government under the Meiji emperor. And with this, we mark the beginnings of a kind of modernity in the context of Japan, because so far, Japan was regulated in terms of its the whole context of the Oriental values that, in a sense, belong intrinsically to Japan, and a kind of interaction with other countries and their culture was very, very minimalistic. So, but with the coming in of the Meiji emperor, things changed, and the influence of the West, in a sense, increased, because for the Tokugawa shogunate, as Japan was called at that point of time, this rule went on for almost like 200 years, more than that, about 260. So when the Meiji emperor took over, there was this need to understand that now Japan needs to be understood differently, in a more modern way, in a sense, at the end of the 19th century. And it's interesting to note this because, Europe, in a sense, is also talking about modernity at this point of time, and the same thing is happening in Japan. So the impact of Christianity and the influx of the Western ideas, all these things begin only with the new, in a sense, political context in Japan. And so, whether it was economy, whether it was the culture, the idea was that now Japan needs to be looked at in a different manner. At the same time, they also tried to preserve the whatever was intrinsic in a sense to Japan, its own culture. And we know that Japan has had an extremely strong tradition of a kind of cultural structure that's there. So in fact, if I may quote Makoto Uka, who says that the reality is that modern civilization in Japan developed through recurrent clashes and alternating domination of two conflicting drives. So one drive was to imitate and master Western civilization, and a drive to act collectively as a nation against the Westernization process. So this is by Makoto Uka. Now this is very, very interesting, because on the one hand there is this need to understand Japan as a modern nation, and we must also remember that this idea of the nation is something that is new in a sense. This idea of nation as in the modern sense of the word is something that emerges only at the turn of the century. And the second aspect is that while there is this drive to allow for the influx of Western values, Western ideas, at the same time there is also this drive against this kind of Westernization to really speaking look at the indigenous and the cultural values that are intrinsic to Japan and its own tradition, be it of writing poetry in a certain form or of imagining certain ideas. So and Makoto Uka then develops this idea further when Uka says that with regard to poetry composition, one can see these two drives did not necessarily contradict each other in an individual poet. They could coexist and become a complex energy source for literary creation. So where in life, in a sense, in fact a lot of critics have pointed out that in a sense in public life embracing a kind of Westernization was the norm, but in private life, preserving the absolutely pure Japanese culture became very, very important. But in poetry one can see the coexistence of both these ideas. Another very important aspect with respect to Japan and poetry as a genre is that around this time, poetry reading became very, very common, and in elementary schools also poetry reading became very significant. And if we were to kind of then jump a couple of decades and look at post-war Japan, so post the Second World War, this idea of the nation that is created at the turn of the century, where we look at a kind of balancing act between Western values and what is in a sense Japanese. So when we move into post-war Japan, there is a kind of skepticism to all these ideas, and the idea, the notion is that something new now needs to be thought about, and the fact that something is gone amiss in this construction of the nation. So and a lot of skepticism towards whatever was traditional and indigenous was there, because the in a sense the influx of democratic ideas took over, became very, very prominent. At the same time, there were a lot of socioeconomic problems that took over Japan at that time, like a famine or poverty, black marketing, diseases, death, malnutrition. All these things were happening, yet at the same time we note in literature a very, very optimistic, a positive tendency to understand the formation of the nation, how after in the post-war scenario Japan had to contend with itself and re-emerge as a nation. So and all these issues, be it of kind of destruction, be it anxiety, be it a tussle with the circumstances, all these in a sense became very, very important in the context of poetry. So and these became the subjects of poetry. So so we've basically looked at two different phases: one, the emergence of the modern state, and second is this whole idea of post-war Japan. And we can see that when we look at poetry by Japanese poets, we realize that there is a kind of shift that happens from this idea of modernity to the formation of post-war Japan. But if we first look at some of this influx of the Western ideas that begins at the end of the 19th century, so we notice that in 1882 there is what is called Shintai Shishu, the first translation of Western poetry, which had poems by Gray, Longfellow, Tennyson, and many others, and these were translated into Japanese. In 1889, we have Omokage, that's translations of Goethe, and in 1897, Wakanashu publishes what is called Toson Shimazaki. So, and the influence of the French poets, particularly, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, and of course, in the American context, Whitman, led to, a formation of a poetic idiom that catered more to, ordinary speech, day-to-day speech, unlike, a more classical, slightly archaic form that was in, prevalence earlier. So, and of course, with this we will move on to a discussion of the different forms, because form in poetry is something that is very, very important to Japanese poetry. And before this, I'd also request Professor Prakash to talk a little bit about these two ideas that are there in Japanese poetry.
Dr. Nagwal, I would think that for our viewers, it will be important to understand what is modernity in the Japanese sense of the word. Because, if we think of modernity in India, then we think of scientific ideas, we think of Renaissance values, we think of humanism. Was humanism there in the previous period? And if it was there, of course it would be there, then would it be then re-christened, redefined, re-understood? Humanism is one. Second is the scientific ideas and values, and a critique of, as you rightly said, tradition. So was that the case of modernity in Japan?
Yes, because in the earlier period of the Tokugawa shogunate, this idea, the Japanese life was regulated more in feudal terms and more in terms of the whole cult of the samurai and so on. But it's only with this shift to the Meiji rule that the need to bring in a more modern understanding, which meant an interaction in a sense with ideas that were coming from the West, especially in the context of poetry. For instance, the translations of the English poets or the French poets into Japanese became very, very common at the time.
Which means that so far as French poetry is concerned or English poetry is concerned, there will be an emphasis on I, there will be an emphasis on the contemporary experience, and French poetry, would bring in lots of, formal elements like symbolism, like images, etc. So would they be then imbibed by the Japanese poets and used in their own verses?
Yes, that's a very interesting observation, because this is one of, when we take a look at some of the poems, the construction of the individual, the I, is something that is in a sense a kind of influx of Western ideas, and it is something that is taken up by the Japanese poets.
Whereas the feudal form would be that people talk about society and nation and geography and mountains and all, but then the same things when they come to the mode of modernity would start also focusing upon the individual experience.
In fact, it's interesting to note that a lot of poets were greatly influenced by T.S. Eliot. And translations of the Wasteland and a Wasteland school of poets was also there in the 20th century. So
Wasteland would be written in 1920 and immediately it would be translated into Japanese.
Japanese, yes.
And it would start affecting Japanese minds and their value system.
Yes.
And Wasteland particularly would also refer to a kind of disenchantment with the modern world, because T.S. Eliot is a modern poet using modern techniques. At the same time, he is critiquing in the Wasteland all that is there in front of him.
Absolutely, because we also have the whole context of the war in the backdrop. So the translation, in a sense, of the Wasteland becomes very, very significant, and in the Japanese literary context, this realization of the I, the individual, becomes very, very sharply felt. And at the same time, the individual I is also associated with ideas of kind of freedom, democracy. These ideas are also kind of being associated with the individual.
You mean wisdom is not there in the tradition, wisdom is there as a subject of understanding by the individual who looks at it from,
Yes.
from a distance.
Yes.
So that's what starts emerging in the Japanese poetry around this time.
Around this time.
And one very interesting thing you have said about the background of war in the 20th century, and because this war devastated all earlier values and systems, therefore Eliot would particularly appeal to them in a big way.
Yes. So, in fact, if we just take a look at the forms, now the oldest form is is known as the waka. It was influenced by Chinese poetry, and if we had Japanese poets who wrote in Chinese, and this was called the kanji, and in Japanese it became the waka. So there are a lot of these forms that are there, and as I said, that form is extremely crucial and central to Japanese poetry. So for instance, we have the haiku. I mean, today I think on a yearly basis, at least 2 or 3 haiku collections come out in Indian English poetry. So the haiku was very popular. There is the Tonka. The haiku is a 3-line short poem. It's generally non-rhyming. The Tonka is a 5-line poem, and where the haiku has 17 syllables, the Tonka has about 31 syllables. And one of the oldest, in a sense, anthologies of Japanese poetry is the Mayoshu, which has more than 4,000 poems. So,
can you give an example of haiku here?
Yes. In
please
fact, something very interesting actually that I want to discuss about the haiku today is that our understanding of the haiku is in terms of a 3-line short poem, and so there can be a series of these 3-line short poems that express a certain idea. Now, in the 17th century, what was happening in Japan was very, very interesting, because haiku was also, there's a part of a kind of process of playing, of gaming, and so you have what is called the wash basin sequence. So there would be an initiating stanza, and different poets would respond to that, and the trick is that you have to take an idea that is there in the initiating stanza. From there, when you move on to the next one, the second stanza for instance, so you pick up an idea that was there in the first, the third stanza will pick up an idea that was there in the second stanza. So to just explain this idea, I'll just explain. This is from what is called Sarumino. This came out in 1691, so towards absolutely the end of the 17th century, and it's translated as Monkey Straw Rain Cape. Now, in this there is, it is compiled by Nozawa Boncho and Mukai Kayore under Basho's guidance. One of the most famous poets of that period was Basho. So, and here the important element is not the integrity of the haiku alone, of that 3-line poem, but the link. So, it's linked verse, as it is called. And because it is part of a process of playing, of gaming, it is done, there is something spontaneous and instantaneous about it. It's not something that is kind of already done and got to the forum. It is something that is that the poets respond to there itself. So for instance, the initiating stanza of the wash basin sequences, the wash basin's dripping gives way to crickets chirping. So the first line is the wash basins, second line dripping gives way to, third line crickets chirping. Now this is by Boncho, and Matsuo Basho responds to this in the second stanza, which is with oil burning low and early to bed autumn. So this wash basins idea of dripping creates and the crickets chirping, so creates this whole idea of evening and the oil burning low and early to bed autumn. The fresh new straw mats have just been installed in the moonlight. Now this is the third stanza by Okada Yasui. So as we can see, the initiating stanza is by Nozawa Boncho, the second one is by Matsuo Basho, the third one is by Okada Yasui, which is the idea of an early to bed autumn. Now that is developed further. Fresh new straw mats having just been installed in the moonlight. So like this, when we move to
these are 3 haikus?
These are 3 separate haikus by 3 different people.
and they are connected through the theme.
They are connected in a sense not just broadly through the theme, but they have to respond to the previous
idea
one.
Initiated in the first.
In the first, and they have to respond to the previous stanza. So the idea is that a kind of chain is created.
A chain is created, a kind of sequence is created.
It's called the wash basin sequence.
So it's the early evening, then late evening, and then night.
Yes.
And there are 3 pictures. And if I, just look at the things that you have presented from the point of view of meaning, then it means that the writer is associating the time with birds, with sounds, with light, with darkness later, and that's how the meaning keeps on expanding.
So from crickets chirping to which tells us that it's evening, and then early to bed, oil burning low, like one can almost imagine the flame going dim. Early to bed, autumn, and then in the third stanza, fresh new straw mats and the moonlight.
This is what you meant by game playing?
Yes. So and this is done there and then. It's not as if they carry these verses with them. They respond to it there itself.
Do they sit together and do it?
Yes.
So one person speaks or one person writes, and then the other person hears it and then takes it forward.
I assume that. So the idea is to respond to the initiating stanza. The second person who writes has to respond to the initiating stanza. The third person responds to the ideas of the second one, fourth to the third, and so on.
Just a kind of query here. All these people sat together and did it?
Yes, I was also quite intrigued with this, and I actually checked this up again, and which is why one of the things that was mentioned was that link is the thing, and instantaneous refiguring is done. Imagination and memory are very important because of this, not observation, because it is done in that very minute. So
physically they were present.
Yes.
They sat together. One person wrote the first haiku. The second continued with it.
Yes.
The third one continued still further.
So, and one can see, it could also, for instance, by the time the wash basin sequence reaches the 7th haiku, which is written by another poet called Kairai, the 7th haiku goes like this: reaching a gallop, upper arm strength no match for the spring cold. So from autumn we are now, it's a spring. And the 8th one goes like this: atop Mount Maya, clouds hang about. And finally, the last 2 haikus I'll just quote. The 12th is return at once, a missive from her man Kairai, a missive from her man, this is again by Kairai, for he who is dubbed the feudal lord's golden boy, life must be a kinch. So one can see that it has expanded to an extent that it's now started bringing in different ideas, and it's quite different in a sense from what the initiating stanza was all about. And this is called the wash basin. This particular collection of haikus is the wash basin sequence. So different poets at times. Then I looked when I was reading other haikus. So at times. The authors were not known because the sequences are there. So some places the poet's name is mentioned. At some points where the poet's name is not available, so it's the unknown poet.
Will you call the sequence a journey in space or in time? Because you have referred to that. The space is changing, the time is changing.
I think it's also an imaginative journey in a sense. It's an imaginative journey that allows you to connect yourself with the present moment in terms of the haiku that you're responding to, and at the same time you kind of take it beyond that and develop it further to another haiku.
And very clearly the imagination is at work.
Yes.
It's not any kind of intervention in the atmosphere in society, but the poets are contending with one another. And in front of them is the weather, in front of them is the time, in front of them is the place.
Yes.
And it is far away from the social context, so to say, that might reflect on the time in which they write. But so far as the poets are concerned, they are basically talking to one another and taking the cue from the previous person and giving the cue to the next person.
Which is why one of the critics very rightly had mentioned that, this kind of playing that happened in the 17th century in terms of the haiku. So it was important that like-minded people actually sat together. So there was this kind of, I can just imagine the kind of energy and the vibrations that this must have really created.
which is these days in India that there is a kind of meaningless game played through Antakshari. But this is not Antakshari that way, because this is where the mind is very much at work, and memory, of course, does play a role, but then there is creativity in this.
Yes.
And people are bound by the tradition that is there, and that tradition is of expanding the meaning.
Yes. So, and if we really look at the modern haiku, I mean, I'll just read out Kawahigashi Hekigoto's haikus, and this is Hekigoto belongs to the late 19th and early 20th century. So we know that the haiku always deals more with nature. The primary thrust is nature there. So Hekigoto's haiku goes like this: cold spring day, above the fields, rootless clouds. Another haiku, the no by torchlight, on the woman's mask, one shaft of light. So there's a woman, but the light, the image that is created is very, very interesting here. Then in 1949, for instance, Matsumoto Takashi had, who's also a lyricist, writes some very, very interesting haikus. Her summer kimono, loose untied, yet somehow dim. In the brothel, a room empty, autumn evening. On an onion tuft, a butterfly settling, lonely, sad. So nature and mood are kind of, entwined in the more modern haikus, but with a kind of, in the sequence, one can see a kind of playfulness of developing the ideas further. So the modern haikus are, of course, not in that sequence format. The sequence is done by the individual poet. Is not done by, it's not done collectively as it was done earlier.
Are there references to people also here? Individuals, that is?
The references to individuals are oblique. They are through nature. The individual is not the prime area of interest. It's through nature. So
is there emotion in the haiku?
There is emotion in the haiku. Again, what one perceives in nature and its impact then on the individual, because there are haikus that also kind of focus in a sense on human follies and foibles, and that's the senryo. So the senryo is, in a sense, is also uses the form of the haiku, but the focus is on people. But
on people, nature.
Yes. Here too, one can see, for instance, there's no mention of any woman here in Takashi's haiku here. It goes like this: in the brothel, a room empty.
In the brothel?
In the brothel, a room empty, autumn evening. So I think that describes the mood very clearly. Now,
and it raises lots of questions.
Yes, even though the woman is not directly mentioned, but I think the empty room, the autumn evening, really describe a kind of sadness that's there. And again,
perhaps the work has come to a standstill. Perhaps the person has gone away. Maybe the person has been dismissed. Maybe the person wasn't happy. All those things, are being, put there.
Yes. So that is it's not as if the human element is missing in the haiku, but it's approached in a very different manner. So again, if you look at this, on an onion tuft, a butterfly settling, and the third line goes, lonely, sad. Now, the butterfly here could represent just about anybody or any idea.
It could be weakness, it could be activity, it could be a person, it could be just the insect, whatever.
Yes.
And what does onion signify, if one can guess? That must be put as a question to the reader.
To the reader. And with this, this is the haiku. Now, after the haiku, another very important form that's always existed in Japanese poetry is that of the Tonka. And Tonka is the 5-line poem. And I will just share some Tonkas with you here. So a poet called Ito Sakyo, late 19th, early 20th century poet, writes, when cowherds begin to make poems, many new styles in the world will spring up. So it's a 5-line short, each line is almost like a short phrase. When cowherds begin, second line is, to make poems, Third, many new styles. Fourth, in the world. Fifth, will spring up. So, a 31 syllable poem. And then again, I have forsaken the land of men and have come to a place where white waves split earth in two. And now these can be, I mean, if we look at the time period around which these tankas are written, so it's at the end of the 19th century where we are talking about the need for change. And I think new styles in the world will spring up, or white waves split the earth in two. I think they are in a sense change oriented. They point towards some kind of change that is happening in the world in the context of Japan. And that is very well expressed in these.
So, would you say that Tonka is a kind of extension of the haiku?
Tonka is a kind of, but somehow I also felt that the kind of brevity that a haiku really achieves and acquires is very different from the Tonka. And the Tonka, of course, because there's more space in a sense to develop the idea further, so the ideas are more explicit in a sense in the Tonka.
As I heard the Tonka, I felt, you know, that somebody was going to say something consciously in Tonka, which was not the case there. There it was more imaginative. So
suggestion is higher in that sense over in the haiku, but in the Tonka, as I said, it's kind of more explicit. It's more stated in the Tonka.
And things are very directly connected with each other.
Yes.
If there are 5 lines or 5 phrases, those one phrase emanates from the other. There's not much of a change. It's just a kind of continuation.
In fact, I actually want to share Tankas by a very famous woman poet who lived from 1878 to 1942, and the poet is called Akiko Asano. So Akiko Asano has written some very, very interesting Tankas, and here again it's explicit, it's pointed, it states things the way they are. So she writes, no camellia, nor plum for me, no flower that is white. Peach blossom has a color that does not ask my sins.
Not ask my?
Sins.
Sins. Oh.
Sins. And in a lot of these tankas, Akiko Asano is basically talking about not adopting what is, in a sense spiritual, but is stressing on materiality in a sense, and is also, talking about the body. So in another tanka, Asano Akiko says, you never touch this soft skin surging with hot blood. Are you not bored expounding the way? Way, W is capital. So I think the idea that you live in the here and the now, and this in a sense is also an expression of female sexuality through the mode of the tanka.
And one has taken leave of nature, one has taken leave of imagination.
Yes.
The person has come very, very down to earth, has achieved that kind of clarity of vision, and one is making a statement with pauses.
With pauses.
A new line is a pause.
Yes.
And but the continuation is there, and there is more of the body, there is more of the concrete reality, maybe relationships and all those things. So because times are changing in the 19th century or early 20th century, so the form also is changing.
Yes, and Tanka's form that was there for very long, but the Tanka is being used very differently in the late 19th century. These ideas of modernity that we've been discussing, this becomes in a sense a kind of prime subject of the Tanka.
It was difficult, let's say, for the haiku to become modern, but when Tanka came into being, when Tanka was being used, then the person was talking about the world around.
Yes. I think one of the reasons for that is that the central concern of the haiku is with nature. Whereas with the Tanka, that kind of point of view is
attention is shifted to the here and now.
Yes.
Not nature.
Now, for instance, there's another tanka that I'd like to share here. It's by Ishikawa Takuboku, who writes, working, yet no joy in life, still staring emptily at empty hands. So
this is very profound.
This is very profound. Yes. And
please explain this in your way.
Yeah,
what
I think when we talk about a lot of poets who were greatly influenced by the American, the French poets, a kind of this staring, still staring emptily is really very, very, it disturbs one, and this understanding of modernity also as a kind of emptiness, the contradiction that is there in terms of Western ideas and the whole idea of the Japanese, culture, and yet at the same time how people look around and a kind of emptiness that they feel inside, working, yet no joy in life, still staring emptily at empty hands. That despite the fact, it also very clearly points towards a kind of disparity that is there in the world, where people are working yet their hands are empty, yet they are still not able to get what is their due. So I think the poem can be looked at, and again, if we look at this very Tonka from the point of view of a woman, so working and the empty hands, I think it acquires a totally different meaning.
That all the fruit of labor has been taken away by somebody else, and the woman finally was left with empty hands.
Yes.
So that female male division also might be there, which I hear is quite sharp, in the Japanese society.
Yes.
Women, have to always bear the tradition and do very great hard work, and men also do hard work, but then they are relatively free.
Relatively free.
So that kind of difference also is emphasized through Tonka effectively.
Yes. So another Tonka is by Takuboku. They might have hurled stones to drive me out, memory that can never be dulled.
Okay, well.
So I think memory as a repository, that you might throw stones at me for anything, but what is there, what is going on in the mind is going to remain alive.
It will register.
It will register
in the mind, and it will stay there.
It will stay there. It will not go anywhere.
And if it's a bad experience, then it will haunt you.
Yes.
And maybe the person then is activated to go against it sometime later.
Yes.
Out of anger, or out of frustration.
In fact, with these two forms, I'd also like to bring in, at the turn of the century, a new style of poetry, which is a more free style of poetry using more of a kind of natural speech. This is the Shintaishi, or new style poetry. So, for instance, Kotaro Takamura, again late 19th and lived till about 1956, had written a lot of what was called the Chieko poems, and Takamura himself was not only a Japanese poet but was also a sculptor, and was greatly influenced by Rodin, and he met Chieko Naganuma, and in the kind of spirit that he saw in Chieko Naganuma is something that he really wrote about in his poetry, and also the kind of balance between ideas that are Western and what is Japanese. All these are issues that Takamura takes up, and at all times favors the free-spirited ideas, personal freedom, liberation, and so on. So I'll just read out a little bit from one of Takamura's poems that tells us how Shintaishi, or this free style of poetry, is being used in a sense by the modern poets, 20th century poets in Japan. So this is how the world is: a group of nasty, callous people, gripped by the superficial and nothing else. That's why those who try to be true to themselves, whether in past times, today, or in the future, are judged perversely as not being serious, and suffer the persecution you suffered. Because Takamura also dissuaded Chieko from marriage, and felt that it was more of a trap. So, and he says that it should be despised, this world. They are the ones who should be ashamed. These little people caught up in its void. We must do what we have to do, follow the road we have to follow, respecting who we are. So I think with Takamura we can see how, where haiku rests on a kind of suggestion, the Tonka makes it more clear, but the freestyle poetry is used to very good effect by the 20th century poets, because here Takamura is extremely critical of the world and says that the kind of structures that people have set about, be it marriage or otherwise, should be despised, and we should do what we have to do, follow the road that we have to follow.
Is there a length that is prescribed for Shintaishi?
No, there's no length that is prescribed, and these are generally very long poems. So
long means how long? From
so
1 page to 5 pages?
Not 5 pages really, but certainly 1 page, more than that. Most poems would run into 2.5 pages. So this is also only an extract from a poem. So these are just 2 stanzas that I have picked up.
Which means that typical Japanese poem is haiku, and a bit extended from that is the Tonka. But so far as Shintaishi is concerned, it's a poem that seems to have been, from the point of view of form, lifted from the Western world.
Totally. The Shintaishi is something that is greatly influenced by poets from the West. So, and we know that around this time, at the end of the 19th century, a lot of these translations of poems by the Western poets came up, and people started writing in that very form. So, where the form, in a sense, can be the influx of, let's say, from the West, a lot of these ideas, the idea of the individual is also an influx from the West, but all this is tied up with the context of the Japanese culture, the Japanese social situation, all that is brought in.
Social situations means social structures, emotions, or family or government or policies?
Well, different poets have looked at it very differently. So the form, the Shintaishi it's evolved, it's like, it's an expanse, because there is no, in a sense, kind of guideline, a specific guideline that this is what Shintaishi would be. So each poet has kind of, for instance, this very poet, Takamura's poet, and in a sense modern poetry begins with Takamura. So who also writes another poem, which is the tone of this poem that I'm just going to read, which is by Takamura, is very different from the Checo poems that I've just shared. So Description of a Day is another poem by Takamura. I finished the brush and ink sketch, waiting for it to dry. I stand back and look at the rock curtain on Mount Hotaka as seen from Kamikochi, and it goes on like this. So it's about personal anguish, it's about the landscape, references to places like Myojin Peak, Mount Hotaka, Mount Rosanna. This is also part of the Checo poems, but the tone of this particular Checo poem is very different from the one that I just read out earlier. So along with Takamura is another very, very important poet called Shakutaro Hagiwara. Again, after Takamura, the person, the next poet who actually brings in this element of modernity and expands this idea of the Shintaishi is Shakutaro Hagiwara. So, and is talking about nature very differently. We've looked at nature from the point of view of the haiku, but in Shintaishi, it goes like this: an upright thing of green sprouts out of the ground. A bladed thing of green springs out of the ground, piercing the iced over winter. And when its green leaves shine on the morning's empty road, tears fall, I let tears fall. Even now, from over the shoulders burdened by remorse, the hazy roots of bamboo spreads out, and the bladed thing of green sprouts out of the ground. So this idea of the green emerging from out of the ground can be anything. It can be new life, it can be new ideas, it can be a movement towards something different. So all this is kind of packed together.
Is it time bound? Does it give reference to any particular incident in society at the time?
This is not time bound in that sense, but I think it's more about a very, very significant change that is happening, because if we look at the years to which Shakutaro Hagiwara also belongs, he lives from 1886 to 1942. So, and this is exactly the time period. I mean, in a sense, the post-war disillusionment has not set in, which sets in after the Second World War.
And maybe some kind of industrialization happened in Japan?
Industrialization happened. At the same time, as mentioned earlier, that this idea of change, because this is very, very new in a sense to the context of Japan. under the Meiji leadership.
For instance, schools would have come into being.
Yes.
There will be an education-centered society.
Yes.
So those changes would have made these people write a statement. Then just looking at nature and wondering about it.
And which is why the constant emphasis, I think, in this particular poem of the green that's sprouting out of the ground is a suggestion that there is something new that's happening.
Is there any politics in these poems? If one may just ask, I'm just wondering from your reading that perhaps the person is asking someone else to keep one's eyes open and look around and see critically. Is that there?
I think so, because with Takamura particularly, I think it's very clear, because Takamura just totally begins by saying that this is how the world is, a group of nasty, callous people. And with Shakutaro Hagiwara also, this idea of...
Is this phrase there?
Yeah, in the previous one, not in this poet, by Kotaro Takamura.
Could you repeat?
Yes, the first stanza is that this is how the world is, a group of nasty, callous people, gripped by the superficial and nothing else. That's why those who try to be true to themselves, whether in past times, today, or in the future, are judged perversely as not being serious, and suffer the persecution you suffered.
Please comment on this.
So, I mentioned that Takamura is really I think it's as political as a poem can really get. So the Shintaishi's form is used to very good effect here.
It appears to be a kind of dialogue spoken from the stage,
yes.
As somebody is addressing another person.
So in the same tone, then there are other poets, for instance, a later poet called Zunjaburo Nishiwaki, who was also greatly influenced by Surrealism and the Surrealist movement, and writes poems like Rain, the Sun. So Rain, it goes like this: a tender goddess came on a south wind, wet prawns, wet fountain, wet swallows' breasts and golden hair, embraced tides, lapped sands, drank fish. So this idea is further developed. Though this is a short poem. So as I said, the Shintaishi in a sense it's because it's new poetry. So everyone, the length is something that each poet has looked at in his own way. So there are other poets like Shigeji Tsuboi, again a later poet, who along with Hagiwara Kayojiro, he was the co-founder of the Dadaist anarchist poetry journal called Red and Black in translation, that is Akatokuro. And Tsuboi's poetry again includes the influence of traditional Japanese forms like the haiku, and yet at the same time the modern Western ideas and Western movements such as Dadaism and Surrealism. So for instance, if you look at a poem that Tsuboi has written called Sunflower, so it's just in 3 lines and very, very meaningful. O sunflower, flame that is born from flame, explosion into the sun, and it ends with an ellipsis. So, O sunflower, flame that is born from flame, explosion into the sun, and ellipses. So this idea of change, this idea of, in a sense, of transformation in the society, flame from flame, moving from strength to strength.
What is the time of this particular poem?
This should be in early 20th century, around the 1920s and so on.
Would there be poems written around this Second World War?
Yes.
Can you take up a few
Yes,
points
I'll just
because this happened, atom bomb attack happened
yes.
in 1940s.
I would just like
Second
to
World War.
Yeah.
Just see.
There is another poem by Tsuboi which is one of the most famous ones called Balloon, and it goes like this: face towards the sky, an immense yawn was given, and then from the inside of a mouth a single balloon came popping out as it ascended up and up to the sky. Gradually it expanded to a hugeness. So it's a long poem, and it finally ends with above that small city's roofs the balloon dingle dangles about the same as ever, at the whim of the blowing wind, to the west, to the east. And yes, a very important poet, Saburo Kuroda, who writes a poem called Prisoners of an Era, and writes, freedom of speech and freedom of action are taken from them. What else do prisoners have? very little, people say. A corner of sky torn from the window, memory and dream. Who will remember what happened there? At the prison gates. The prisoners take back what was seized from them, hats and clothes they recognize. Joy, the joy of their release, into a future dreamt through memory. Who will remember what they have forgotten? And then disillusionment. The poem goes on. As I said, some of these poems are very long, and I'll just read the last part, which is, in those lost days, behind bars, what did you tell yourself? In the crowds of the station, what did you tell yourself? And now, in the midst of your newfound happiness and freedom, what can you tell yourself?
How long is the poem?
It's quite long.
10 pages?
No, not 10 pages. It's about 3 pages. Two and a half pages.
And this seems to be, from the point of view of theme, a poem written somewhere in the 1940s and 50s.
Yes.
Where the person is angry, the person is sad, the person is thinking of that thing which has been taken away from memory.
Yes.
But he'll remember.
And there is a question. The question is about, now that you have your newfound happiness, what can you tell yourself? In the sense that in this new world, when the world has changed, how do you react to it?
And newfound happiness, there is a lot of irony in this.
Yes, there is a lot of irony.
At the background is not happiness at all. There is devastation, there is violence, there is, people are cast asunder, all those things are there.
In fact, the poems of the 1950s actually are poems that make use of the modernist trend in a very big way. So, for instance, there is a poem by Shiro Murano called Pole Vault. He is running like a wasp, hanging on a long pole. As a matter of course, he floats in the sky, chasing the ascending horizon. So, it goes on like this. Once more the horizon comes down, beating hard on his shoulders. So, we see that a lot of these poems actually make use of the modernist trends to talk about what is happening in Japan. But then there are poets like Saburo Kuroda, Prisoners of an Era, that I just read, who write about everything directly and don't make use of the kind of modernist fragmentation, but talk about things in a more direct manner.
Please read those poems.
So, Eating the Wind is another poem again by Saburo Kuroda. And now, in Eating the Wind, Kuroda makes very good use of different languages. So, kacha means glass in Indonesian, gacha means elephant, kacha kacha, gacha gacha. Saying a word twice makes it plural. Lots of glass, lots of elephants. Once you get used to all that noise, it stops being so noisy. Life in the city. Kacha kacha, gacha gacha. Lots of glass, lots of elephants. I think of them wistfully like fairy tales. It's been more than 10 days on the plateau. I walk between corn and flour bean fields thinking, maka angin. In Indonesian, eating the wind means taking a walk brisk and elegant. Eating the wind means running away in Japanese. But I am not running away from the city, just eating the wind on a path on the plateau. So, the eating the wind.
For the first time, there is a reference to another country,
Yes.
Indonesia.
Yes.
What about China? Are there references to China?
A lot of the use of the kanji and a lot of Japanese.
China was a colony and Japan was a colonizer.
And in poetry, the Japanese were greatly influenced by the Chinese.
The reverse has happened.
The reverse has happened. To begin with, they're greatly influenced by the
Are
Chinese.
there references to America? Well, Whitman, you said. You said that there is an inspiration of Whitman in the 19th century.
Yes. And we have women poets here like Akiko Asano, who's the stress on female sexuality, the references to the Checo poems. They all kind of bring forth a different idea of modernity, which also kind of appeals to the women.
Could you read a poem from a woman poet?
Yes. Akiko Asano, black hair tangled in 1,000 strands, tangled my hair and tangled my tangled memories of our long nights of lovemaking. So, on the one hand, it's about memory, it's about black hair, and the tangle is like a story within a story. Then there is another poet, very famous poet called Kyoko Nagase, 20th century poet, and would have pretty much written, I think, through the 50s, 60s, and writes what is called a song of a woman. With no friends of your own, you are looking only at me, and you accuse me of being inconsiderate. No, not enough. No, not enough. Not enough proof of loving you. How insolent of me not to look happy all the time. How impudent of me not to be able to forecast today's weather for you. You always tell me to do things I can't. I want to start learning magic. I want to stop your criticism with a single glance. I want to put your heart to sleep with one finger. I want to go out every night riding a broom. I want to jump over the mountain ridge trailing my hair like smoke. I want to fly into sparkling moonlight. You, so simple, give no thought to the pain that is almost killing me. Yet you will calmly go to heaven by and by, and I, having wished for witchcraft, will fall to hell. All that will create 10 billion years of separation. So
it's a very angry poem.
It's a very angry
and a poem of revolt,
Yes.
and a poem of deep criticism.
So, I mean, you know, the women
And a whiff
poets,
of fresh air in Japanese poetry.
Yes.
For this reason.
Totally, because I mean, prior to this, one really speaking sees a lot of preoccupation with nature. The idea of modernity is approached, but for some in a direct manner, but in a lot of poems, because of the impact of the modernist strain from the West. So they approach this idea in a slightly indirect manner. But with the women poets, we can see them, you know, be it Akiko Asano or this particular poem by Kyoko Nagase called Song of a Woman. It's absolutely direct.
From the point of view of form, would you put in the same form, Shintaishi?
Yes, this is all new poetry.
I see. So now that we are coming to the end of the discussion, would you like to sum it up, make a few statements about the poetry as a whole?
So when we look at modern Japanese poetry, we need to look at it in terms of these two very different historical moments that bring in two very different phases of Japanese poetry. So the end of the 19th century triggers the advent of modernity in the Japanese literary scenario, where there is an interaction between ideas that are intrinsic to Japan with an influx of ideas from the West. And the idea of experimentation, the coming up of Shintaishi or New Japanese poetry is coupled with an understanding of a new understanding rather of the haiku, of the Tonka, forms that had always been there in Japanese literature. And with this, we'll move into the second phase, which is that of the post-war Japanese scenario, where there is a kind of disillusionment that sets in. The idea of the nation becomes, open now to discussion, and the ideas of democracy, in a sense, become very, very vital. So the post-war poets, those very poets who, in the pre-war scenario had there was a kind of positive spirit that was there. In the post-war scenario, there is a kind of disillusionment which is expressed through the modernist poetic idiom.
Well, friends, as we come to the end of the discussion, Dr. Payal Nagpal has emphasized a peculiar aspect of Japanese poetry, and that is regarding form. The early forms were very short, and then came the final form in the 20th century, which was the form, where length was no limit. So maybe from 7 syllables or from 5 lines earlier, the poem became as long as 3 pages, 4 pages, and even more. So which means that Japanese poetry has had this kind of a evolution into what can be called a social vision, or can be called an ideological statement, and that now Japanese poetry is a part of world poetry. Japanese culture is a part of world culture. So we come to the end of the lecture. Thank you, Dr. Payal Nagpal, and viewers, I'm sure you would have enjoyed this discussion on Japanese poetry presented by Dr. Payal Nagpal. Thank you.